Look, development and selling typically means that the first and the foremost is that you would be exposing yourself to GST, the general sales tax side of things, pretty much right away. So you need to account for the GST side of things. Also, the second most important thing is the margin schemes. So a lot of people don't remember what contract did they signed and, did they adopted for the margin scheme or excluded the margin scheme. So margin scheme plays a really big part in you delivering the profit or not. And so understanding some of these complexities is quite important. Hello and welcome to Help Me Buy Property podcast. Today, our topic of discussion is, should I develop my PPOR? Now, developing a PPOR always seems like a valid outcome, especially if you're sitting on a big block of land or the prices in the areas have a discrepancy between brand new houses and old established properties. And so these discrepancies come and go all the time. You need to perform detailed due diligence and analysis as to what is possible. So in today's episode, we will discuss best ways to understand whether you should be developing a PPOR or best ways to actually create a more value out of PPOR. This will help us understand whether you should think about developing your principal place of residence and how do you go about doing it. Let me introduce my co-host before we get right into the topic. Drum rolls, Cheryl. How are you today, Miss Cheryl?
I am amazing as always, Moss. Always excited to talk to you about cool stuff around property, investing, and in this situation, potentially some development as well. So let's get stuck into it. And as always, we want to throw in our little bit of a disclaimer there. Anything to do with property and to do with your taxes, because there will be discussions about taxes here. Please speak to your accountant, preferably someone who is a specialist in accounting and understands the tax implications and can do some tax planning for you before you do anything else. Before you agree on 100%. Anything, before you sign anything, make sure you get across what the tax implications are for your situation.
And so people do get crazy ideas, right? Because they see their neighbor doing it, they see someone on the street doing it, they hear barbecue conversation that, someone is developing their principal place of residence, or hey, being a developer is such a cool thing these days. And so they fell into this FOMO of, I want to do developments. Of course, speaking to the accountant and understanding your capital gains tax and GST implications out of things is quite important because, you might make a lot of money, but you might see that the tax man with a big bucket at the end of the deal, taking all of that money away from you. Whereas typically, if you think about principal place of residence, they are tax-free, right? There is no capital gains tax attached to it. So you might, think about creating value, but, automatically attach a capital gains tax to it without realizing.
Yeah. And this is, the thing that we want to talk about is whether you're doing it yourself or potentially you might have someone who wants to purchase your property or might want to do a JV with. But let's talk about what are some of the options. And we hear this often, you might have a big block of land and you sort of go, maybe I can subdivide the backyard. Hold up. What are some of the things that we need? First of all, what are some of the different strategies you can consider to develop your property?
Yeah, look, from developing a principal place of residence, my personal opinion is that, you should always consider it in a certain stage as part of your property investment journey. That should not be the first thing that you do when you're building up your property portfolio, right? Typically, it's a transitioning into a property development world. It's one of the easiest way to transition into the property development because you have a principal place of residence, you have a big backyard, you're splitting it, you're living in the property. It becomes a lot easier rather than acquiring a brand new site to get into development. So it makes a lot more sense. And so that's why when people are acquiring properties, I always emphasize that you need to think of an exit strategy for every property. So if the exit strategy for your principal place of residence is sell, then there is no point in forcing a development, right? For a lot of people, it might be downsizing. And so they don't want to go down that path. And that makes a lot more sense. It's only when, the brand new properties are selling at a lot more premium than the established properties is where it makes sense. I see a lot of people making that mistake where they take the original value of their house and they basically take the final price of what the land is selling for or what the townhouse is or the ultimate product is selling for. And that's how they do the feasibility. And that's the biggest risk, right? Your worst case scenario is not your purchase price. Your worst case scenario is what you are going to sell your property at today. And that should be your bare minimum benchmark. And you should see what the development profit looks like from there onwards. From an example perspective, if you acquired the site at 500,000 and if you can sell this at 800,000 today, then your feasibility should assume that site cost is $800,000 and that $300,000 typically is the growth profit that should be protected at any cost. And so feasibility, I think, plays a really, really big part in the first decision around, whether you should be developing your principal place of residence at all anyway.
Yeah. And I think the thing to consider is, just to be clear, like you could be developing it and holding it or developing to sell. So there's going to be two very different outcomes as well. Which do you want to talk about?
I think developing to sell. Okay, so developing to sell and hold, while there are two different strategies, ultimately the outcomes that you're trying to get to, some of the prerequisites in relation to, getting to those outcomes, the product market fit, etc., are still quite the important ones. But I'll let you take the pick, Cheryl. I think the easiest one is hold, right? Develop and hold. Let's maybe start there.
Yeah. So develop and hold, some of the things you might think of, I'm going to put a granny flat in the back, or I'm going to knock it down and build a duplex, or I might add another house in my backyard. So what are some of the implications and the considerations there? But I'm going to hold for long term. I might rent out the property. I might rent out the granny flat. I might rent out the extra property that I build. I might rent out the other side of the duplex. So that's sort of develop and hold.
A lot of people,
strategy.
when they think about develop and hold strategies, especially for their principal place of residence, they need to think about it from a tax side of things. And that becomes really, really important, because the way you do the development is going to dictate whether you're exposing yourself to capital gains tax or not. If you talk about, say, land splits, right? So if you're saving the house at the front and building one at the back, typical battle axe strategies, for you to split the land first and then build a house at the back and then moving yourself at the back and renting the front place or selling the front place is a better strategy than selling the house at the back first, because you can stagger your capital gains tax out of things quite easily if you split, build, move, sell at the front or hold the front, because you have basically created that capital gains tax threshold for yourself, so that the tax officers do not come knocking on your door in some of these instances as well. Again, speak to your accountant in some of these differences, because you're not going to go to a lot of detail talking about various different numbers. We have done an episode long time ago, I think in season 1, where we talked about various different structures and various different strategies about splitting your own block of land and what are those capital gains implications. And I remember Sohail came in and talked about some of those ways to do it. So for people who are quite interested in listening to it, they should definitely go to season 1 and check out that episode. But it's an interesting one, right? I think when you're thinking about buying and holding, typically the CGT side of things and the capital gain side of things plays a really big part. Also, doing your own due diligence, doing your own feasibility plays a really big part, and knowing what is the margin that you're trying to hit for. Don't do it for the sake of, I'm going to call myself a developer. You need to still make a decent margin for you to carry the risk of doing a development there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of being clear as well, not it doesn't need to be to the actual date. Being clear as, all right, what is the exit? Is the long term going to be, am I going to sell one of these, or am I going to hold them till the cows come home? In which case, if you're holding them until you knock off, then you don't have to care and bother about the. It's not your problem. It's not your problem. It might be your children's problem by that point. One of the things to note as well is, just to throw it in there, if you've got property that you've had for a long time or has been in the family for a long time, particularly pre-CGT 1985, then it's happy days because there's no CGT.
Yes.
However, if it's post-1985, then you've got to consider CGT there. So just remember that the magic number.
And I think that's where it comes down to when you see major JV partnerships with the Stocklands of the world and, they acquire thousands and thousands of acres. That's one of the strategies that they are following, right? They are basically targeting homeowners who have acquired the lots before 1985, and so that, they can manage the tax implications quite easily as well.
Absolutely. Okay, so that's sort of like, that's the develop and hold. Develop and sell, a bit more
100%. Look, development and selling typically means that the first and the foremost is that you would be exposing yourself to GST, the general sales tax side of things, pretty much right away. Okay, so you need to account for the GST side of things. Also, the second most important thing is the margin schemes. So a lot of people don't remember what contract did they sign and did they adopted for the margin scheme or excluded the margin scheme. So margin scheme plays a really big part in you delivering the profit or not. And so understanding some of these complexities is quite important. And so speaking to your accountant in a lot of these instances is quite the key. Also, how do you sell it? That plays a big part too. You know, as we said before, as to building one at the back and then selling the front makes a lot more sense than keeping the front and selling the back, because then again, you know, there are different capital implications on both sides of things. The most interesting and the most common one that you see all the time is where people are living in a property and they're building a duplex, and duplex are the crazy ones because you have to build almost both of them at the same time. You can't stagger the build. You can't build one, move into it, and then build the other. Look, I've seen that happen too, but because it costs a bit more. And so do your due diligence around those as well when you are basically considering buy and sell strategies.
Yeah, and because as well, the tax office looks at when, in terms of timing, because the amount of they've got to calculate their capital gains tax. If you've been holding a property for 10 years, haven't touched it, haven't done anything else but lived in it, like when is the trigger point for when CGT starts to be calculated? Is there a fast and easy rule that you're aware of?
Look, I mean, in a lot of these circumstances, typically the 6-year rule wouldn't really apply, right? You know, the 6-year rule where we live in a property and then rent it out for 6 years, and before you sell it, you know, those 6 years are basically tax-free or capital gains free. And even if you rent it out after 6 years, the property still for the first 6 years remains capital gains free, right? In a lot of development scenarios where you're going to develop your principal place of residence, typically people choose one of the properties to live in, which means that you have another principal place of residence to go to. And so that 6-year rule basically becomes mute. I've only seen maybe 2 times in my whole sort of journey of property investment journey where a person did the development and it was their principal place of residence, and they staggered it and then they rent out somewhere else. So that was a crazy thing to do, living a nomadic life. But, you know, people do try and test and different things out in order to manage their tax implications out of things as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, you know, I think everything that we're always going to keep going back to the tax side of things. But I just want to loop back to something that you mentioned in terms of margin scheme. And I know I want to bring this up because I know at the very, very beginning, I got really confused over what's the margin scheme? When does it apply? How do you calculate the margin scheme? So let's start.
Look, I mean, typically the margin scheme allows you to, and so without going into too much detail, or I think there is a lot more, I'm going to try and simplify this for the users as well and help me out. And if I'm using too much jargons here too. My understanding of the margin scheme is that you're signing up a property under the margin scheme. When you are selling the property, when you're selling the final product, you can basically take off the purchase price against the sell price. Basically, that's how typically the margin scheme works. There are certain implications in relation to margin scheme where the tax can be claimed back as input tax credits, or it could be passed on towards the ultimate sale. So, you know, it just depends on how the margin scheme is basically. It also depends on how the margin scheme basically is working, because it's not just you buying the property. It also depends on who sold you the property and whether they opted for the margin scheme or not as well. So there is a lot of like little things that you need to consider. What I want to do for users and listeners as well, just to help them out, is I'm happy to provide a quick sort of guide for people to basically refer back to, so that, you know, people can understand, because it takes a bit of time to get your head around the margin scheme side of things. We got a lot of support from the lawyers in some of the properties that we acquired as to how this margin scheme typically works. But happy to take your feedback, Cheryl, you know, what your understanding is in relation to the bigger side of things when it talks about margin schemes.
And I guess this is where, you know, some of the questions I will ask is, you know, do margin schemes apply for all sorts of properties, or are they only for properties that are part of like a going concern? So like part of a business?
Yeah, very, very interesting question. Look, I mean, the going concern properties, when you talk about the going concern properties, I've never like personally, I've never bought a property with a going concern attached to it. Typically, I've always dependent on making a choice of whether you're applying the margin scheme or not. And a lot of the contracts that I have seen in my own personal life and my own personal experience has been that it was also always dependent on the ultimate choice of whoever this land was developed in the first instance. And so the original plan of subdivision is always called upon when you're looking at some of these margin scheme calculations. So yeah, I'll defer the question back to you, Cheryl. What has your experience been in relation to the going concern and the margin scheme side of things?
Yeah, so my experience, and I guess that's where predominantly, if it's to do with development sites where you might have purchased something which does have a going concern, that's where I've seen the margin scheme apply more prevalently. I personally haven't seen it as much in residential purchases. And again, in which case, if you've got a property that is your PPOR, unless you've purchased it as some sort of a going concern, you might have had GST implications and things like that. That's when you probably have to consider the margin scheme. However, I've seen for most residential PPORs haven't had to do with it personally. And that's just me. Again, bring in your accountant, bring in your lawyers, make sure you've got the team to be able to clarify that for you. Because when you do a development margin scheme, if that's applicable, it does make a difference. There are certain calculations that you have to make, and it's important that you are aware of that. I think it's a session for Sahel or an accountant, so I won't go too much detail with that. But just I want to bring that up because you mentioned it, and also, I mean, I know personally, I wasn't across it. I didn't really understand how it applied. I still can't say that I know 100%, but it is to bring that awareness to our listeners so that it is something that you bring up in conversation with your accountant and when you're purchasing property as well, because you don't want it to sort of pop up and you go, what is this? A few key things just to
wrapping it up in relation to the question around, should you be developing your principal place of residence? Think of the exit strategy, understand the GST, CGT implications, work out a feasibility, and talk about the margin scheme in itself. I think those are the key sort of points when you're talking about just this topic. Moving on, if you talk about various different strategies on how to develop your principal place of residence, what is one of your favorites, Cheryl?
In developing my own, I guess it does come down to what's possible on your land. I could be whether it's have low density, it's depending on the size. So in terms of what my favorite is, I like to build stuff. And so it would be if it's a straight splitter and building a house or a duplex at the back, that would be, and I predominantly like to have multiple streams of income in some way. So it will be something like that where you would split and then you would sell too, mainly also because the high cost of building and the high cost to actually subdivide, you want to make sure that it's worth your while, what you're doing.
100%.
And you reverted to this earlier. So, you've got to do the numbers for that. But I think if you've got a big block and you've seen other people do it in their backyard, definitely look into it. Get a planner in place, get your accountant, understand what that's going to mean for you. And that tax planning is really critical as well. So if you're going to have a CGT bill, probably get that CGT bill in a year that you're not making as much money or whatever that might be. So that planning is a crucial part of that. That's I'd say is probably my favorite from that aspect.
Doing yourself makes a lot more sense, but understand that sometimes it's also okay to ask for help. There are people out there who provide, development management services for you, and they'll do the feasibilities. One of the services that we provide to a lot of the clients, typically is do the feasibility and understand as to how this is done, rather than trying to keep everything yourself, right? Because it is a steep learning curve, right? So it's important that if you have to part away a bit of money to a development manager or a person with experience, I always say this, making less is better than making zero, right?
Yeah.
So it's always the key thing, especially with bigger sites when you are looking at some of these things, that, you need to take those into account as well.
Yeah.
One of the key things that I want to also talk about is when you talk about developments, it's not always about dropping the house and doing something with it, right? Development could also typically mean that all you're doing is just putting plans and permits for the next person to take the baton and basically doing the development, and you leaving enough margin in the deal for that person to basically put through, right?
Yes.
So, it's important that you take all of these things into account as well. Sometimes just doing plans and permits basically adds and lifts your property market up by, 10 to 15% as well. So it's important to do some of those considerations as well. What I've recently seen is where people basically convince their neighbors to join up and partner up and create a bigger pool for a developer to come in and acquire. And in those circumstances, there are usually two schools of thoughts. One is where you combine, 2 or 3 of your neighbors and you say, hey, we are going to basically combine it and sell it together at a premium. And that's a good strategy to go down the path for, where you're not taking the risk of development, but you are thinking about developing. And that in itself, because you've done the work of convincing people to sell it with you, makes the life a lot easier from a developer's perspective, and they'll always pay a bit of a premium. The second important thing also is that doing the plans and permits together. So if you have like 4 neighbors in a corner lot, you can each chip in say $30,000 or $50,000 and pool up the money to around $150,000 to $200,000. Get a development manager in or someone in to basically assist you with the feasibility and do an amazing plan and permit and get it approved, and then sell it to a developer. And in those circumstances and cases, you would see that the amount of money coming back to you is, significantly more than what you would typically be asking for. And what I want to do is I want to share a life example for one of the sites that I have for one of my clients. And the combined valuation of this typical site was somewhere around $5 million. And so, from their perspective, they were making the total GRV on this site typically that I'm talking about was, somewhere around $17 million with a total development cost of 8. So there is literally like $4 million of profit or 30% margin on cost in there for this site, right?
Yeah.
Now you can potentially sell this site for $6.5 million if you really wanted to, instead of 5 if you put plans and permits there, right? Because what you're doing is, instead of taking the margin at 30% and trying to do it yourself, you're asking that extra money by doing the plans and permits yourself. So that $1.5 million, and keeping the margin at 20% for a developer to still be enticed about that extra money that they're going to make, because you're reducing their risk quite significantly as well.
Yeah. And in that situation, does that mean they don't have to worry about CGT? Because
100%.
They've added value, but then it's not what is the trigger point? And I won't, again, this is an accounting thing, but it's more that you've done plans, but you haven't physically done anything with the site.
Yeah, so there is no subdivisions or anything involved, right? So one of the trigger points for capital gains tax is basically any subdivision events or any sale events that has happened, right? And so because there is no, realignment of boundaries, there is no changes in plan of subdivision, etc., typically you don't trigger a CGT event. But just by doing the planning, you are basically de-risking the next person or the developer to come in. You are not only saving them the time, but you're also saving them the cost and the risk of doing this as well, right?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It's quite interesting that, some of these things that we should definitely be considered as well.
And particularly if you're able to work with a developer by providing them some extended settlement periods and things like that, like the more that you're able to de-risk it for the developer, the more that they're happier to take a smaller margin, which means that you get a larger margin for the benefit of de-risking it for them.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, 100%. Definitely. What about some of the bigger strategies, when you talk about JV partnerships, and how does that play, Cheryl, in the bigger scheme of things?
Yeah, and JVs would be, for example, we've been talking mainly about if you owned a property and you want to develop it yourself, or then we move to the next part, a developer might want to buy it from you. But the next part is going, well, the developer looks at what you've got and says, you've held this land for almost 20 years, you've probably got quite a bit of equity in it. Do you want to make some development profit, and why don't we JV? And Moss, I know you've got a lot of experience in this space. Like typically, and we get this question quite a lot, like what would we expect from a profit share? Is that going to be 50-50? Is that going to be 80-20? What's a reasonable thing for a homeowner to expect in terms of how to structure this sort of arrangement? If a developer says, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, I like your property. I want to do a JV with you. If you were an owner, what are your considerations?
And so one of the key things that a lot of people should always do and explore, and I think that's an amazing point that you make in relation to the sharing of the JV profits, is that, for example, if you have a site where you've combined the neighbors, you've done all the hard work, you've done the due diligence, you've put the plans in there, and now you know that, well, you can either sell it as is, or you can make the profit out of this site typically as well. And of course, speaking to your accountant, understanding your capital gains implications, majority of the times you would see that the developers would leave 70% margin for you and keep the 30% margin off the net profit, post GST for themselves, right? Now, various different subdivisions, the cost allocation or the profit allocation basically changes too, right? For smaller sites, the profits are higher. For larger sites, the allocations are smaller. I'm going to repeat myself. For bigger sites, the allocations are smaller. The smaller sites, the allocations are bigger, typically because with bigger sites, there is bigger profits available, and you can stage gate those profits as well. If you're talking about, say, 4 townhouses, for example, a 60-40 split would be quite reasonable, or even 70-30 split, would be quite reasonable depending on the size or the sale of the price and the profit that you're making. But when you talk about land subdivisions, when you have 100 lots or 500 lots or 800 lots and it's a 3 or a 5 year plan, then the JV partner or the developer who's coming in to help you would be able to leave a lot of money on the table for you as well, because they know that the first stage that they sell basically gives them their money back. And so they get a free ride for the next 2 years where they have no money in the project at all invested, and they're using the cash flow from the first stage to basically fund the balance of the stages. So always understand how the structure is working and make sure that you take someone in who's a lot more experienced in dealing with some of these things to get the best deal for you. Developers have this crazy way of setting up deals in such a way that it looks really, really good on paper from your perspective. But then when you step away from the detail, you realize that, okay, I could have structured it better to get a slightly bigger share of the pie as well.
Yeah, and you don't know what you don't know, right? So
yes.
What is common to expect as a homeowner? Say if I'm a homeowner, I've had my block for 20 years. I still have about 100K of my loan that I need to repay off, but say I've got 800,000 in equity. What is reasonable to expect for the homeowner to continue doing? And the developer, what did they pay for? Did they not pay for anything?
Look, typically what the developers would do is they'll take away the cost of doing the plans, the permits, the civils, etc., everything that is required to do on paper. Anything to do with the holding cost, so any loans outstanding, etc., would usually be the owner's responsibility, right? Usually that's how the split typically works. The developer would sometimes ask for the land to be provided upfront as a guarantee as well. And it totally depends on various different scenarios too. I've seen it both ways where they don't involve the funders in the first instance. They bring in all the cash and spend the money through the civils and the DA side of things purely from a cash perspective. And once the first stage is done, then only they bring in, the next level of funders, and they'll always use mezzanine finance to basically fund this rather than going to the main bank anyway, or major bank to basically fund the deal. On the smaller projects, it becomes really, really tricky also when you have a lot of debt on it as well, because the vendor might not be comfortable taking a lot of debt, right? Over the project. And that's where it becomes really tricky, where you're doing only a duplex or a 4-unit site where you're building townhouses, for example, and it's costing you, say, 6 or 7 million to do that construction. The funder needs to be involved. You can't just do it over cash, or a JV partner would never basically bring in all of that amount of cash, because then the deal would typically not work, because the internal rate of return on bringing so much cash into the deal basically makes the profit, or the profit on cash basically, reduces that quite significantly.
Yeah. And so this is where, again, it's just sort of running through those numbers, understanding your feasibility, understanding any sort of arrangement with the builder really clearly. Run it by your lawyer, run it by your accountant. I'm going to say this over and over again like a broken record, because it's something where I've seen people caught out and it's just cost them a lot. What they thought they were going to make mozza on they got hit with a huge CGT bill, and they are a few $100,000 out of pocket from that.
100%.
It is a bit.
Definitely.
It is quite painful if you don't have it set up the right way, and you don't make these decisions rashly. If a developer's come up to you and offered you 3 times what it's worth, happy days if all they're doing is buying it. But then if they're sort of going, well, let's do a JV as well, then you've got to really consider, what does that implication mean for me?
I think golden words. I think it's a golden word wrap up, Cheryl. From my perspective, when you're thinking about selling, I think those are the key things that you should consider. Now, for people who are out there who are going through the similar circumstances or scenarios where they're sitting on a big block of land and they are trying to make these decisions, I'm hoping that, this podcast would provide them a bit of direction. But if they're unsure, reach out to Cheryl or myself or people out there to help you, support you, in order to make that decision easier for you. Okay.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
if you have any stories to share, any comments, any questions, please do drop into our DMs or on the comments on the socials. Thank you for listening to us. Take care, be kind, stay safe, keep investing. This is Cheryl and Moss checking out videos.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.